Okay, guys, it's about 3 a.m. on a Saturday, and I just finished the first episode of this side project that I've been working on, and this is basically my intro for a very unorthodox episode of Obsessive Viewer, that the most unorthodox that we've had. This is basically the pilot episode of a separate solo podcast that I'm doing on my own, separate from Obsessive Viewer. It's ObsessiveViewer.com presents Anthology. Anthology is a show that is going to be me going through Twilight Zone and eventually The Outer Limits, and just basically talking about science fiction television, anthology science fiction television in TV's golden age. So it's a little bit of a niche topic. It's a little specific, I guess, but I just finished like the final version of the first episode, and I'm really, really excited about it. I'm really proud of it, and I'm really excited to get it out there and all that. So before you guys get to that episode, if this is your thing, please check it out. I'm really proud of it. I'm really excited for people to listen to it. And with any new podcast, it's going to be, hard to get it off the ground. So I'm really hoping that our listeners can check it out and see what it's all about. So I'm really, really proud of this. It took me a few times to change it up and edit it and all that in a couple different versions, but the final product is really good, and I'm really excited about it. And before I get to the actual release of it, I just want to thank the people that gave me some very valuable feedback and notes on this episode before releasing it. So Tiny, thank you so much, and also my friends Craig from Intermission, Pat from The Nerd You're Looking For, Chad from The Secular Perspective, and Tiny again, yeah. And I think that's all. Yeah, so thanks, guys. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to doing this little side project on my own. Also, check it out. Go to anthologypod.com. Subscribe to the subreddit at r/obsessiveviewer. And I'm keeping the same Twitter handle. I'm not going to have a Twitter handle for Anthology, so just keep following me at Obsessive Viewer. And also like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod. And yeah, so thanks, guys. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think. Imagine, if you will, a podcast journey beyond that which is known to man. It exists in both fandom and discovery, in viewing and critiquing. My name is Matt Hurt. Welcome to Anthology. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Anthology, a podcast exploring science fiction anthology television during TV's golden age. I'm your host, Matt Hurt. You may know me from The Obsessive Viewer, a weekly movie and TV podcast that I host with two of my friends, and also the Obsessive Viewer blog at obsessiveviewer.com, where I write about movies and TV shows. So you might be wondering why I wanted to do a solo podcast or a side project podcast or whatever you want to call this. And I'll go ahead and answer that for you. I love podcasting. I've been doing it for a couple years now with my friends, and I'm really proud of the amount of work and the quality that I feel we put out of the Obsessive Viewer. But I kind of wanted to do something on the side. I know that there is a lot of podcasts devoted to certain TV shows, and I kind of wanted to try my hand at that. More specifically, I wanted to take a concept or a show and just go all out with it and explore it and watch it. Because usually on the blog I do episode reviews of certain TV shows and season reviews and all that kind of stuff. That can get a little time consuming, and there's a little bit of a lack of interpersonal connection with an audience there. The connection that you get from an audience with a podcast is a lot more vocal and a lot more interactive, is what I found at least. So I wanted to do a solo podcast because I wanted to see if I could do it, and that remains to be seen, obviously. But I wanted to do something just on my own to see what kind of what I can do on my own. And I went through a lot of different ideas for a solo podcast, for a side project podcast, and I don't know, one of the things that stuck out to me is that Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, all services that I have, there's a lot of television content that is all just packaged there for the viewer to consume at their own pace in full. And my immediate thought was, obviously, since I'm a huge Lost fan, I would go back and watch Lost and kind of deconstruct that in podcast form. But I don't know, I didn't really want to spend hours of my life revisiting a show that I love and know intimately and I know personally I wouldn't be able to really view that objectively. So I decided to do a show that was something that I wasn't really familiar with, and that show ended up being Twilight Zone. And the thing about it is, I didn't want to do a specific Twilight Zone podcast. Instead, I wanted to keep it kind of broad and just do anthology television, and most notably, or specifically, I wanted to do sci-fi anthology television. And the Twilight Zone fits that perfectly. So for now, what I want this show to be, what I want Anthology to be, is a podcast that has me going through the Twilight Zone, for starters, for the next several episodes, and then moving on to something like maybe The Outer Limits, or more contemporary or more current anthology television like Black Mirror and stuff like that. So I didn't want to be held specifically to the Twilight Zone, although I will be spending, I mapped it out, it's something like over 100 episodes deconstructing the Twilight Zone and sharing my feelings about it. So you might be asking, what is it that qualifies me to be a host of a podcast about sci-fi anthology television from TV's golden age? And that's a damn good question. Admittedly, one of the things that drew me to the Twilight Zone is that it is a massive, massive icon of television, and it is something that is this behemoth that created so much for a culture of television viewers. Like it's deeply rooted in people's upbringing, and there's a strong nostalgia to Twilight Zone that resonates with a lot of people today. And that's something that I missed the boat on. Twilight Zone aired from 1959 to 1964. I was born in 1986, and so I don't have this connection to the Twilight Zone that a lot of people do. I didn't even really grow up watching reruns. I know that at least on Sci-Fi, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, they have marathons of the show, and I believe they also have, I don't know if it's Sci-Fi specifically, but there's marathons on like the 4th of July. So this podcast is more about me discovering the show. I'm going to be as knowledgeable as I can about this, but one of the main tenets of the Obsessive Viewer that I run is that the show and the blog is about my feelings, our feelings about the entertainment that we consume, and that's something that I'm going to bring over to Anthology. This is about my reaction to the Twilight Zone, and this is how I feel about the episodes and the stories, and it's tapping in. I'm hoping to tap into the emotional connection that's the universality of the Twilight Zone, and how the stories are universally relatable to an extent. And that's kind of my goal for the podcast, is to just really share my feelings about the Twilight Zone as I'm discovering it myself, and other Anthology television as I move on. And obviously with a solo podcast, it's going to be kind of tough. I've never done this before. I've always had co-hosts to kind of bounce ideas off of and discussion off of. So if you're listening to this, please do not shy away from contacting me with your input, your thoughts on episodes of The Twilight Zone, anything that I'm about to discuss or have discussed, anything like that. I crave feedback, and I crave the interactivity of an audience. So you'll find out where you can reach me in the show notes and in the outro and everything. But for now, you can tweet me at ObsessiveViewer, or you can email me, matt@obsessiveviewer.com. Now, every episode of Anthology is going to cover, at least for now, at least in the first 3 seasons of The Twilight Zone, it's going to cover 2 episodes per episode of the podcast. So I'll just go in order of when the series aired, when the show's aired. So I'll get to the episode descriptions and episode analysis and thoughts and all that in a moment. But for now, I want to kind of introduce listeners to the Twilight Zone and to kind of give a little bit of background on the show, a little bit brief background on the show and Rod Serling. First of all, the Twilight Zone aired on CBS from 1959 to 1964, and it was a massive hit. It had an average weekly audience of close to 18 million people, and one of the main things that drew people to it and was recognized as one of the main tenets of what the Twilight Zone was that it had an emphasis on ordinary people. And these ordinary people entered the Twilight Zone and were surrounded by surreal environments, situations, otherworldly presences, stuff like that. So the emphasis on ordinary people is what really made audiences connect with the stories being told. And that gave Rod Serling and his writing team, he wrote a considerable amount of it, by the way. At least in the first season, I think it was something like 80% of the scripts of the first 36 episodes this season, I believe, were written by Serling himself. But they all had a foundation of ordinary people, and that's where it really connected with audiences. And of what I've seen so far, at the time of this recording, I'm about halfway through the season. It's magnificent. It resonates so well today, and I'll go into more specifics as I get into the meat of the podcast. But it's something that is truly, even today, still worth marveling at. A little bit of background on Rod Serling himself. Immediately after high school, he joined the Army. He was a paratrooper in World War II. He fought in the Pacific Theater. And he went to college on the GI Bill, worked in radio, but he spent all of his free time working on his own writing projects and kind of went the freelance route, which at the time, this is like early to mid-50s, this is when television was at... It was a great time to be a freelance writer for television. He would submit scripts. Every script he wrote, he would submit it to radios and radio plays and television, because television was populated by countless anthology shows that had just live performances. So he worked tirelessly at writing and submitting his work to various places, and it wasn't until January 1955 that his 70-second television script was aired on Kraft Television Theater, and that script was called Patterns, and it was a massive hit, earned him his first of what would end up being 6 Emmys, and suddenly he had just offers from everywhere. He was a big name writer in Hollywood, and what was even more successful than Patterns was a year and a half later, his teleplay Requiem for a Heavyweight premiered on Playhouse 90, another anthology show, and that was a big hit for him, even bigger than Patterns, and he just continued to have success with teleplays, and eventually he kind of set his sights on making an anthology series because I think a lot of it was he was upset with how censored his work was, and he also knew, I assume he also knew that television was changing from live broadcast to film. So in 1957, Serling dug out the time element, which is a script that he wrote after graduating college, and he added the Twilight Zone to the title and submitted it to CBS. CBS, there was some, I don't know if there was necessarily some blowback from it or anything like that, but they didn't really like it. But in November of 1958, the time element actually aired on Desilu Playhouse. After more struggles behind the scenes, it actually kind of got put in production kind of by the skin of its teeth. I'll do a proper episode about the time element at a later time, maybe a bonus episode after this season of the podcast. But the time element was a big success. Like, that episode got more mail than any episode that season of Desilu Playhouse. And that success actually convinced CBS to order a pilot for the Twilight Zone. Serling, however, couldn't use the time element since it had already been produced, so he wrote The Happy Place, which was a script about a totalitarian government that basically executes people when they turn 60. I'll talk about it when I talk about the pilot episode of the Twilight Zone here in a bit, but The Happy Place was deemed too depressing by CBS, and there was a meeting, and they told Serling that they weren't going to do that, and then Serling just kind of looked at him and was like, all right, well, I'll write something else. And what he wrote was Where Is Everybody? It's an episode that became the first episode of the Twilight Zone, the first of upwards of 156 episodes of the Twilight Zone. And having said that, I'll go into the discussions of the episodes, but first I want to preface this by saying that this is actually my second go of recording this podcast episode, this pilot episode of the podcast, and I'm keeping the discussion that I made, or the episode discussions, intact where they are. But I need to preface this by I need to say that throughout most of this recording, I refer to Rod Serling as Sterling with a T, and I need to tell you guys I'm not an idiot. I just looked at my notes and it was just there, and I just ran with it, and then, yeah. So blame autocorrect, blame Archer, but don't think that I'm ill-prepared. So having said that, I'll give a brief episode summary and then kind of give a rundown of the talent involved in it. Mike Ferris finds himself alone in the small town of Oakwood. Without recollection of his name, where he is, or who he is, Mike wanders through the town, desperate to find another living soul. It starred Earl Holliman, who was 30 when he got the role in 1959. He played a character in 1956's Forbidden Planet, which I haven't seen, but it's kind of a, I don't know if it's necessarily a staple of science fiction, but it has stood the test of time. It's still relevant today. I think at the time of this recording, the Artcraft Theater in Franklin, Indiana, is going to have a screening of it for their Sci-Fi or Sci-Frenzy film festival in October. And he was also, Earl Holliman also had won a Best Supporting Actor Golden Globe for his role in The Rainmaker, a romantic Western starring Burt Lancaster and Katharine Hepburn. I don't know if that's necessarily stood the test of time. I had never heard of it before this. He won that Best Academy Award, he won that Best Supporting Actor Golden Globe in 1956, the same year that he played Cook in Forbidden Planet. He's still, as far as I could tell, he's still alive today, but he hasn't acted since 2000. So I'm not sure if he's just retired or what. The episode was written by Rod Serling, which I'll get into. I feel like he is deserving of an entire episode. I haven't had the time to really dive into the research of Mr. Serling. But the director of this episode was Robert Stevens. He directed 2 episodes of Twilight Zone and 44 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, for which he actually won an Emmy in 1958. Alfred Hitchcock Presents was a crime or suspense anthology series. The anthology series apparently were all the craze back in these days, back in the late 50s, early 60s. I actually thought about doing an Alfred Hitchcock Presents spin-off podcast of Obsessive Viewer, and it would have been called Obsessive Viewer Presents Alfred Hitchcock Presents, a podcast presented by Matt Hurt. I'll add in a laugh track in editing. My feelings on this episode as an obsessive viewer that I am, it's incredibly ballsy and very impressive. Once again, the subject matter of this episode is that this guy is alone in this deserted town, and throughout the entire course of events, he slowly loses his sanity, and the end of the episode reveals that he's actually in the Air Force. He's an astronaut in training, and this entire scenario is a manifestation of his brain in dealing with long-term isolation. I think it's 484 hours of isolation in this small box, about 2.5 weeks worth of time he spent here, and his mind manifested this thing. It's all for test piloting, or it's all a test for space mission, for manned missions to the moon, which I'll get to that in a moment. But as a viewer, as the way that the storyline plays out and the way that the episode itself goes through, it's, as I said, it's impressive and it's incredibly ballsy, because the majority of the episode actually relies on Holloman's performance, and because he's literally the only character on screen throughout about 22 minutes of the 25-minute runtime. And the idea of opening a series with this kind of nuanced storyline, this kind of nuanced story on screen with just one character, I mean, it saves money, I'm sure, but and I assume it would be a relatively easy shoot, but it's also, I mean, if the audience hadn't liked his performance, the entire show would have been just in complete jeopardy, and I can really respect that as an artistic choice from Serling and his producers and his writers. And I will say that Mike, the character who actually goes without name until about the 15, 18-minute mark, maybe, he is incredibly likable. Holloman's performance is... he's got this affability to him that is kind of reinforced through the screenwriting, through the actual script. Because I mean, throughout the episode, he turns the cafe sign after he leaves it. He turns it to closed, and he tries hard not to startle the mannequin when he comes across a mannequin. He kind of has this very human, very personable personality on screen when he's interacting with actually no one, but these little pieces kind of make you really root for him. When he has that conversation with himself in the I guess soda shop where he's making a sundae, it's, you kind of see where he is coming from as a person who's terrified, but he's also kind of not necessarily making the best of a bad situation, because he doesn't make the best of it because it's a horrible situation. But he has this aura about him, where he's having a conversation with his mirror image, saying that, you know, I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. Your face looks vaguely familiar, but I don't got your name. He's kind of, it makes it really easy for the audience to stand behind him and root for him to overcome whatever the hell is going on. And even when he finds the mannequin, one of my favorite scenes of the episode is where he finds the mannequin after he realizes that she's a mannequin. He talks to her, and he kind of jokes with her, with this inanimate object, and he apologizes for startling her, and it's really interesting. It's a duality in that scene where he's slowly losing control. He's almost, I mean, arguably he's lost control at that point, but he's also got a sense of humor about it. Like he's kind of humoring himself to, you know, not lose it while he's slowly losing it. And that kind of storytelling, the way that kind of unfolds through the storytelling as the episode progresses, like the story itself relies on slow building tension, and I absolutely love how the camera matches that, because the climax where once Mike goes into the theater where he sees a postage or a poster outside of the theater for a movie called Battle Hymn. It's an Air Force movie, and that's when it kind of clicks with him. He's in the Air Force. He has some relation to the Air Force, and he's really excited because that's the first time he's had any hint of who he is. And it's worth noting that's at about the 15-minute mark of the episode. So up until that point, we've had 15 minutes of just this guy wandering around, and most, if not all, of the charm of that is that he is so likable, and his performance is so strong in that he has complete control over his character as his character is losing control, and that's a performance that I really, really appreciate. And so once he finds out that once he goes into the theater, he's had a breakthrough. He's running through and he's trying to find someone to share this breakthrough with, but he can't find it. And this is when he's starting to lose more control, and that's when the episode and the storyline itself kind of starts playing with this veering into surreal territory. Like we had a little bit of that when he was at the phone booth earlier in the episode. He goes into the phone booth because the phone rings and there's no answer. But this is where it kind of really goes, it ratchets up, and the climax is where he sees the film playing, and he runs up to the projection booth and doesn't find anyone. And what I really appreciate this is after he finds that there's no one in the projection booth, he runs down the stairs, and this is by far my favorite scene of the episode, where you see him, the camera is static, and you see him running down the stairs and running toward the camera, and then he just smashes right into a mirror. So what the camera was doing was the camera was static on a mirror, and then it shatters when he goes in. It's a very disorienting kind of sequence. It's a startling, and I mean, it might be a little bit of a cheap scare, but it's also a very, very startling scene for the viewer. And from there, it seems like the entire climax of the episode is filmed almost entirely from skewed angles, with a score that just builds and just assaults the viewer until Mike is running through the town, and he finds I think he collapses, and he sees the eye because he's in front of the optometrist, and he's screaming because he thinks someone's watching him. This is where he's lost his mind, and then he hits a call button, or he hits the walkway button on the crosswalk, and that's when the people in charge of the isolation booth kind of take him out. And I love the way that the story unfolds. That's what I keep coming back to, is that it's such a natural progression, and it's played so well by Holloman that it's hard not to get really, really invested in his character, even though not only does he not know anything about himself, we as the viewer have no idea what's going on. We have no context for who he is or what he is. We just have these little hints that he is at heart a good person and someone that we can root for as he slowly descends into this kind of madness. So that's how I felt about Where Is Everybody as a viewer. And I must say that this episode was such an awesome entry point to the Twilight Zone. It's like I said, it's very nuanced, but it's very approachable, and most of that approachableness, that approachable factor, is based on Holloman's performance and the incredibly sharp writing. So next, I just want to touch briefly on kind of the historical and cultural context of it. There's reference to a bomb. Mike kind of contemplates whether there was an atomic bomb at one point. And I thought that was incredibly poignant of the time, because this aired in 1959, like late 50s, before the 60s. And this is, that was, from everything that I've read, very much on the cultural consciousness, was the idea of nuclear winter and an apocalyptic event and stuff. So I thought that was I have no context for this. I have no idea how audiences might have felt when this aired, but I can only imagine that seeing this kind of scenario play out, like before you find out what the actual deal is, I mean, it seems very adaptable that this scenario could be an apocalyptic event brought on by a nuclear bomb, and it's a terrifying thought, and it's even more terrifying when you're to imagine it as someone in that time, in that era. So I thought that was very. I wouldn't say it was a cheap shot, but it gave a lot of really good atmosphere to the episode. And another thing that is really noteworthy, and kind of on the opposite side of things here, is that Mike, in the episode at the end, it's revealed that he's training for space flight, for a manned mission to the moon. The episode actually closes with him looking up at the moon and telling the moon that to hang tight because he's coming for it. And it's interesting to note because this aired in 1959. This was like John F. Kennedy made his speech about putting a man on the moon in 1962, I believe. And this was a couple years before the Russians put the first person in space on April 12th, 1961. Yuri Gagarin? Sorry. And also this episode aired 2 years after the Russians launched Sputnik. So it was kind of in the midst of the space race before, we really had, from my limited historical knowledge, I must preface this, before we had our kind of ducks in a row as far as space travel was. So I thought that was really interesting and kind of hopeful to a certain extent. I mean, it's one thing to imagine that we're putting someone on the moon at that point in time, but it's another thing to this may have been more careless or more bleak than I'm giving it credit for, because it shows that the isolation of humanity, like isolating humans, is not healthy, and putting a man into space is going to just destroy his sanity. And I think that that's really the important thing to focus on now that I think about it. But I mean, I can't help but, as a fan of space travel, I kind of want to look on the bright side of things, and I want to see that this is, I want this to be a positive, that okay, Rod Serling wanted he believed that there was an effort to put a man on the moon. I guess it's a stretch, because it is. I'm trying not to look at the negatives of it, and I wholeheartedly admit that, just as a fan of space travel. But the pessimist in me does recognize that this is a bleak look at what the space race and what putting a man in isolation into space could do to his humanity, and that's really kind of depressing, to be frank. Also, a little bit of trivia about this episode to kind of close out this discussion of the episode. The town square set, and this is something that I noticed. It was an interesting thing. It was later used in the Back to the Future movies. That was the set used in Back to the Future in the 80s. And it's funny because watching this episode, when I first saw it, I recognized the set. I recognized the atmosphere, but I couldn't place it. I couldn't place where it was. And then when I read this trivia, I was like, of course, that's Hill Valley. What? Why didn't I notice that? But it's very noticeable when you go back and rewatch it. I've watched it a couple times now, and it's very much noticeable, and it's kind of fun to imagine that it may be in the same universe, although that's a stretch. And another interesting piece of trivia is that Earl Holliman had actually suggested that his character tear out a page in the phone book in the phone booth scene and then find it in his pocket at the end. And Rod Sterling told him that executives wanted the show, or told interviewer in later interviews, said that executives wanted the show to be more grounded in reality. But apparently this ending is later used later in the series for another episode. I'm actually looking forward to seeing that play out, because I kind of like that. I really appreciate Where Is Everybody for going the kind of natural route and kind of really grounding it in reality, the realistic route. But I'm really interested in seeing a more metaphysical or more surreal and paranormal even things play out throughout the Twilight Zone. Also, another piece of trivia is that this was the first episode of the series, but Sterling had actually written an episode before this called The Happy Place. And in it was about a society where people are executed when they reach the age of 60. Pretty bleak, Rod. It was deemed too depressing and ultimately scrapped. And this makes me really want to see Logan's Run. I've never seen it, so I might have to go see it. But I think that would be a very interesting Twilight Zone episode. I don't know if it was ever reused or anything like that. But like I said, it makes me want to see Logan's Run, and I will see it eventually. But I think that could have been an interesting episode of the Twilight Zone. Not necessarily an interesting first episode, because, as I said before, the bleakness of man losing his sanity in an effort to go to space is a bleak affair in its own right. And this would have been probably, I hate to side with studio executives, but I think that they made the right call for not at least opening the series with this episode with The Happy Place, because it would have been too bleak, way too bleak. And then the final piece of trivia that I have for this episode is that Earl Holliman actually had the flu while filming this, which makes me respect his performance all the more, because you really would not think that he had the flu during filming, and to see him give such a strong performance in an episode that is completely dependent on his charisma and on his reaction to the situation that he's in, to see him battle that, or to see him execute that so well while also compromised by his health is really, really fascinating and really impressive to me as a viewer.
Join the Obsessive Viewer podcast on October 16th at the Irving Theater on East Washington Street for The Obsessive Viewer presents Shocktober in Irvington Part 2. It's a one-night event screening of short films, including the premiere of J.P. Leck's The Lantern, the latest entry in his cross-medium Elsewhere World universe, as well as a modern retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart from the guys at Synapshot Productions and Billy and Brandon Watch Movies. There will be giveaways, raffles, interviews with the filmmakers, and so much more. all proceeds will go directly to the Irvington Historical Society. For more details, go to shocktoberinirvington.com. October 16th at the Irving Theater. Help support local filmmakers and a great community with The Obsessive Viewer.
So the second episode of The Twilight Zone and the second episode of this inaugural episode of Anthology is called One for the Angels. And here's a brief summary to kind of jog your memory if you haven't seen it yet. At the time of this recording, it is available on Netflix and also on Hulu. When death arrives to claim pitchman Lou Bookman, the man successfully bargains for more time. However, his deal doesn't go the way he imagined. This episode stars Ed Wynn as Lou Bookman. Wynn was a star comedian in vaudeville who turned to acting at the insistence of actually his son Keenan Wynn. Ed's screen career had kind of a mix of comedy and drama. His most notable roles were as Uncle Albert in Mary Poppins, and his 1956 performance as Army in Requiem for a Heavyweight, which was the second episode of Playhouse 90, which was a live drama anthology series, which is a kind of a genre it's a genre of television that I'm not familiar with, the live drama anthology series. From what I understand, it's basically writers wrote plays, and then the plays were, I guess, the stage performances were directed and screened on television. That's my understanding of it. If someone listening has a better or more accurate description of what a live drama anthology series is, please contact me and correct me. Anyway, Requiem was actually also written by Rod Serling. The episode actually won 6 Emmy Awards, including Best Direction, Best Teleplay by Serling, and Best Single Program of the Year. And it's also really worth noting and really impressive that Serling... Have I been saying Sterling? I have been saying Sterling because I didn't check my notes. God damn it. Rod Serling. It's particularly worth mentioning that Serling also got the first Peabody Award for television writing for Requiem for a Heavyweight. And that's really fascinating. I believe that you can find Requiem for Heavyweight in its entirety on YouTube. I'll if I can dig it up, I'll throw the link in the show notes to this episode. Co-starring in this episode with Mr. Wynn is Murray Hamilton, who was a character actor with 156 TV and film acting credits throughout his career. He plays Death in this episode, and it's worth noting also that his various roles included the role of the mayor in Jaws 1 and 2, Father Ryan in the Amityville Horror, and Mr. Robinson in The Graduate. And he plays Death in this episode, and it's so good. His interplay with him and Wynn is just really, really satisfying, and it's really entertaining to see them kind of play off each other so eloquently and so well in terms of the subject matter of it. And I'll go ahead and use that to leapfrog into my feelings as a viewer on this episode. So basically, the entire episode is Edwin's character, Lou Bookman, kind of trying to bargain for his life with death. And it's worth noting the actual only historical/cultural context I have of this episode is that this episode actually aired 2 years before... No, I'm sorry. 2 years before this episode aired, Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal was released, and in the movie, a man's fate rests on a game of chess he plays with the Grim Reaper. I haven't seen it, but it's available on Hulu Plus if you have that, because it's part of the Criterion Collection. It's one of the most popular movies and one of the most well-respected movies that I know of. And it's a gap movie for me. Also, before I get to my feelings as a viewer, this episode was directed by Robert Parrish. It's actually his first of 3 episodes of the Twilight Zone that he would direct. Before turning his sights on directing, though, he was an accomplished editor. He actually won an Academy Award for editing a movie in 1947 called Body and Soul, which was a boxing noir film starring John Garfield. Which is interesting because actually Rod Serling had a... Because Requiem for Heavyweight is about boxing as well. By the way, guys, I've been saying Sterling throughout this episode. I apologize. It's Rod Serling. Anyway, my feelings as a viewer on the episode One for the Angels. My immediate reaction when rewatching this episode prior to this recording was, man, this episode is just phenomenal. It's Edwin is just really endearing as an old man who isn't ready to give up his life, but is ready to admit or is, I guess, a little saddened to admit that he doesn't have much of a life to give up. And I mean, in the episode, it's revealed that he's in his late 60s. He's just basically a pitchman. He sells items in a little case to people walking around town. And this is another episode where the writing really makes us feel for the protagonist, because they show him as this, I mean, granted, he goes on to try to trick death and try to buy more time for himself, but with disastrous consequences. But he's so endearing in the way that he's portrayed by Wynn, and it's kind of this delicate balance between comedy and drama, which is what his career was known for. Edwin's career was known for, is that he's so good with the children in this episode. There's a bunch of kids outside the building where he lives that kind of flock to him when he comes home from a busy day of trying to sell stuff on the street. And the kids, it's kind of shown that he's got some kind of a rapport with the kids, and they have kind of a standing, like, okay, they're gonna have ice cream after the kids have their supper, and seeing that this is a regular thing shows that the parents of the kids don't mind it or anything like that. There's nothing nefarious with it. There's nothing malicious or anything. It's just this old man who really, he doesn't have a family of his own, but his time is spent with kids who adore him as if he was their grandparent. And that's something that really made me immediately root for Lou Bookman. And once he is introduced to death, it's really not, I wouldn't say heart-wrenching, it's tense. It's suspenseful to see him try to bargain for more time. And he's a bit slow on the uptake on it. And what I love about Hamilton's performance as Death is that he has this kind of malaise about him, or this kind of like, okay, Mr. Bookman, here's all the stuff. I'm Death. You're gonna accompany me at midnight, and it's kind of this kind of matter-of-fact way. And when it clicks for Lou that he's to die that night, he obviously goes through the various stages, and he kind of tries to bargain for more time, and Hamilton's character Death has a very nice line where he's like, no one's really ready to go when it's their time, and he kind of tells him to look on the bright side and say, like, hey, you're one of the lucky ones. You've got the your precognitive death that you know ahead of time. You have time to put your affairs in order and all that stuff, and you're not like, think of the people who come to a grisly death or a grisly end in a violent accident, like kind of trying to show him perspective. And it's kind of this, it's delivered with this, as I said, like kind of a malaise, but it's also kind of this, like, okay, I'm practiced at this. I'm Death. I've been doing this for a long time, but he is not without his compassion, which is a strange thing to say about the character of Death, but it's endearing nonetheless. And having that kind of performance in a Death character, playing off of an endearing old man character who is he's not belligerent in trying to get his way or trying to get more time or anything like that, but he's endearing in that I as a viewer connected with his pleas with Death. Like he tries to Death goes on to tell him that he's got a few options for why he can stay, and there's extenuating circumstances. The one that he chooses is that he has unfinished business of a I can't remember the phrasing of a significant nature, and Lou goes through a couple different examples of unfinished business, like, oh, I've never ridden in a helicopter before. I need to do that before I die. And then Death kind of laughs him off, and kind of a pleasant kind of laugh. He's like, no, that's not going to cut it, Mr. Bookman. And then finally he settles on he wants to make a pitch, a final pitch, like one that a pitch that would make the skies open, a pitch for the angels. And that's where, after a bit of convincing, that's where Death kind of, lets him be, and it's like, okay, Mr. Bookman, I'll let you do that. And then there's probably one of it's a really nice, like, outward piece of humor in this episode is that the second that they make the deal, Lou shuts the door in Death's face and is like, nope, all right, I'm never going to make a pitch again. And it's kind of this interesting situation in which he feels like he's fooled Death, and he's so cocky about it because he just outright tells him through the door, he's like, nope, never going to make a pitch again. Nope, done. I've got plenty of time left. But Death isn't having it, and this is where it kind of takes the story takes such a twisted turn, is that not only like Death is forced to make an adjustment, and one of the kids that Lou is friends with ends up getting hit by a car, and she's on her deathbed, and she has until midnight to either pass through the pain or pass through the situation to be good, or to be healthy again, or she's going to die, which Death has to meet his appointment to get her at midnight. So the episode ends, and this is where the episode takes a turn that really spoke to me as a viewer, and something that I really appreciated is that the show takes it to where it's about 15 minutes until midnight, where Lou is waiting for Death to show up for Maggie, the girl that's been injured. And what happens is Lou wants to distract him. And what I love about this, I love the way that the storyline plays out, because he needs to distract him, because it's set, or the situation is set where Death needs to make his appointment to kill this girl by midnight. And what I love about this is that there's a scene where Lou decides to distract him, and he starts taking out his chest of things that he sells on the street. And Hamilton gets this look on his face of just bemusement. He's amused by it, and he's kind of like, there's a knowing, it's not outwardly spelled out, and even in a few minutes it's actually kind of taken back a little bit, but there's a knowing glare that Hamilton gives to Wynn as Lou is getting all the stuff out. And it's this knowing glare that tells me as a viewer that Death, maybe he's somewhat compassionate, or maybe he doesn't really care, but it's this thing where Death knows, okay, Lou is going to pitch to him, and maybe it's amusement at seeing a man doing what he loved, and maybe he's not really seeing the full scale of it. But what he's doing is he's doing his pitch to the angel, to a pitch for the angels, which I don't know, like you don't really know as Lou is doing it whether or not he's cognizant of this, but by the end you know, because there's a wonderful moment where he's won over death. Death has bought all of his stuff, and he's just exhausted, and then he realizes, oh, you made me miss my appointment. You made me miss it. I'm late. Do you know what you've done? And then there's just this wonderful. It closes on such a wonderful scene where Hamilton or Lou says, like, that's the greatest pitch I've ever done. It's one that opened the skies, and it's a pitch for the angels. And then he kind of quietly packs up his stuff. He says, I'm ready, and then they walk over. And what I love about this, there's a bit of a button on the end of the episode where Lou and Death are walking side by side, and then Lou stops, and he's like, hang on 1 second, I forgot something. And in that moment, you kind of think, for just a brief second, you think that Lou is going to make a run for it, and that he's going to try to trick Death again. But what he does is he grabs his case. And this is something that resonated with me as a viewer, because he's so passionate about selling. He's a salesman, and he's a pitchman. And so he grabs his case, he packs it up, and then Death looks at him and he's like, that? And then Lou's like, yeah, people up there might need something. And then he just pauses and he's like, up there, right? And then Death is like, up there, Mr. Bookman. And it's so interesting to me to see a character who is dying, an old, compassionate man who seemed a little regretful of a life kind of poorly spent. He's alone, he has no family, anything like that. But seeing him reach a point of contentment with his life, and the knowledge that he's saved a young girl's life in the process, is so just beautiful. I mean, it's not the downer ending of a Twilight Zone, or it's not the signature Twilight Zone twist. It's just a very human story about really recognizing your fate and embracing death in a way that I wouldn't have expected from a Twilight Zone episode. And it's something that I really, really, really loved, and it really resonated with me. I don't know if I would say that One for the Angels is necessarily the better episode of these two, but it really resonated with me, and both of these episodes really resonated with me as a viewer and as someone who it made me think a little bit, take a little bit of an introspective approach, and it made me relate to these characters in ways that I couldn't really fathom beforehand. Like I didn't question my mortality, but I kind of thought, like, it made me have an emotional attachment to the characters in both Where Is Everybody and One for the Angels. It made me have this emotional attachment to these characters, and made me wonder and ponder for a moment just what I would do in their situations. And it's something that's a skill set that I hope to see more of as we go on with the Twilight Zone. So, well, that's basically all I've got for you this week, or this episode. Again, this is a little rough. I apologize. I called him Sterling so many times. I've been watching too much Archer. But I hope that you guys enjoyed it. And you can find the home of Anthology Podcast is at anthologypod.com. And I'll have a pre-recorded outro that I'll tack onto this episode. So I want to thank you guys for listening to me blather on about the Twilight Zone and Where Is Everybody and One for the Angels. And I hope to see you guys next episode, in which I will be discussing episodes 3 and 4 of the Twilight Zone, which are Mr. Denton on Doomsday and the 16mm Shrine. Both are, I'll save that for next time. So thank you guys for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to hear from you. Thanks. Thank you for listening to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. You can find past episodes of the show at AnthologyPod.com, and please subscribe on iTunes and leave a rating and review. It helps the show out more than you might think. Of course, I crave feedback or conversation of any kind from the audience, so please email your thoughts and feelings about the show to Matt@ObsessiveViewer.com, or you can tweet me at ObsessiveViewer, and make sure you like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod. Of course, you can also leave me a voicemail at 317-762-6099 for a chance to have it played on the show. If you like what you've heard here, I urge you to check out The Obsessive Viewer, a weekly movie and TV podcast I host with my friends Tiny and Mike. Also check out the Obsessive Viewer blog at obsessiveviewer.com, where I write movie reviews, TV reviews, and the occasional editorial about the business of entertainment. You can find all of that at obsessiveviewer.com. If you want even more obsessive content in your life, subscribe to the Obsessive Viewer subreddit at r/obsessiveviewer, and check out obsessivebooknerd.com for book reviews, author spotlights, and a general celebration of reading. Finally, if you're philosophically curious, check out my friend Tiny's side project podcast, The Secular Perspective, which explores the concepts of faith, religion, and existence from the perspective of secular hosts. You can find that at thesecularperspective.com. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.